The last thing I noticed before I left for the Flagstaff run was the way Dena hugged me. Not the hug itself. 11 years of marriage gives you a library of someone's embraces, and you stop cataloging them consciously the way you stop noticing the sound of your own refrigerator. What I noticed was the release. The specific moment she let go. Most times Dena held on a half-beat longer than necessary, a habit I'd always read as her way of saying what she didn't put into words, that she hated the long routes, that 3 weeks felt like a month, that she'd be counting. This time her arms dropped cleanly, efficiently, like a task completed. She stepped back and smiled and said drive safe and went back inside before I'd reached the truck. I sat in the cab for a moment with the engine idling. Then I pulled out of the driveway and pointed the rig west on I-40 and told myself it was nothing. She was tired. Maya had kept her up 2 nights running with a cough that had finally cleared. The smile had been real enough. I told myself that for about 300 miles. My name is Cole. I'm 39 years old and I have driven long-haul routes across the American Southwest for 14 years, the last 11 of them married to Dena, the last 9 of them out of a house on the east side of Amarillo with a cottonwood tree in the backyard that Maya has been trying to climb since she was 6. The work takes me away for stretches of 2 to 3 weeks at a time, Phoenix, Flagstaff, Albuquerque, occasionally up into Colorado or down into El Paso. It is not a glamorous life by most measures, but it is an honest one, and for most of those 11 years I believed it was also a shared one. 2 people building something across distance, held together by phone calls and the particular discipline of people who understand that absence is not the same as gone. I had a CB handle, Dust Road, that Hank had given me years ago and that had stuck the way nicknames do when they're accurate. Hank drove the same circuit, 2 days behind me on most runs, and had been my closest friend since we trained together out of a depot in Lubbock. He was the kind of man who said very little and meant all of it, which made him, in my experience, considerably more trustworthy than men who said a great deal. Hank had called me 2 days into the Flagstaff run. Not on the CB. On my cell, which he used only when something wasn't casual. You got a minute, he said. I'm rolling, I said. But yeah. A pause. The particular pause of a man organizing something he'd rather not say. When you get back, he said finally. I need to show you something. Show me now. Not on the phone. When you get back, Cole. I drove another 40 miles in the direction of Flagstaff with Hank's voice sitting in the cab beside me like a passenger I hadn't invited. The desert light was doing what it does in October, going copper and vast, the kind of light that makes everything look simultaneously closer and farther than it actually is. I called Dena that night from a truck stop outside Winslow. She answered on the 4th ring, slightly breathless, said she'd been in the backyard. Maya was already in bed. We talked for 11 minutes, I know because I checked the call log later, for reasons that will become clear. The conversation was ordinary. School pickup, a leaky faucet she'd had a neighbor look at, Maya's cough finally gone. Ordinary in the way that a conversation can be ordinary and also, I now understand, carefully constructed to be ordinary. The leaky faucet detail was true. I later confirmed that. The neighbor who looked at it was Brandon. I want to be accurate about the before, because it's easy, in retrospect, to paint the whole marriage in the color of what I eventually found out. That would be dishonest. Most of 11 years was real. The early years especially, Dena and I had built something genuine in the way that people build things when they're young enough to believe in the permanence of effort. She was a legal assistant when we met, sharp-minded and organized in ways that complemented my own tendency toward instinct over paperwork. We married quickly by most people's standards, 14 months after the first date, because we both recognized something and neither of us saw a reason to wait. Maya came 3 years in, a deliberate decision made over a long weekend in Taos that we'd both remember differently and both remember warmly. The long routes were always the friction point. Not a secret, Dena knew what I did before we married, knew the schedule, accepted it in the way that people accept the conditions of a life they've chosen. But acceptance and comfort are different things, and over the years the acceptance had occasionally worn thin in ways I could feel without being able to precisely locate. She'd become quieter during the runs, less communicative, her calls shorter and more functional. I'd attributed this to the ordinary erosion of long distance over time, the way the effort of connection gradually demands more energy than it seems to return. I had not attributed it to anything specific. That was my error, and it was not a dramatic one. It was the quiet error of a man who trusted his own read of a situation that had quietly changed. The first sign I can identify with certainty was 8 months before the Flagstaff run, though I didn't register it as a sign at the time. Maya, who was then still 8, told me something during a video call from the road. We were talking about her day. She'd had a good one, some project at school about Texas history that she was genuinely excited about, and she mentioned, almost parenthetically, that Brandon from the gym had come over for dinner. "Who's Brandon?" I said. "He owns the gym Mom goes to," Maya said. "He fixed the thing under the sink." "The faucet?" "Yeah. And then he stayed for dinner." I registered the name. I registered the dinner. I did not, I am now certain, register them with appropriate weight, because I was 3 states away and exhausted, and Maya had already moved on to the Texas History Project and the moment passed. Brandon. Filed under neighbor, helpful, present when I'm not. A category I apparently kept too large and examined too rarely. The second sign came from Hank, though at the time it arrived sideways and I didn't know what it was. We'd crossed paths at a depot in Tucson in July, the way we sometimes did on overlapping routes, and shared a meal at a diner attached to the fuel stop. Hank had been quiet in a way that was different from his usual quiet. His usual quiet was settled and comfortable. This was the quiet of a man sitting on something. I'd asked him directly if something was wrong and he'd said no, said he was tired, said the Albuquerque run had been rougher than expected. I'd believed him. Hank didn't lie, as a rule. What I didn't know was that Hank had driven through Amarillo 2 weeks earlier, on a personal trip to see his sister, and had seen something he hadn't known what to do with. He told me all of this later, after the Flagstaff run. He'd driven past my house, not deliberately, just the route, and seen an unfamiliar truck in my driveway. He'd noted it. He'd told himself there were explanations. He'd sat with it for 6 weeks before making that cell phone call. 6 weeks of Hank sitting on something is a long time. He is not a man who sits on things lightly. Dena had started going to the gym 14 months before the Flagstaff run. This I knew. She'd mentioned wanting to do something for herself, and I'd encouraged it without reservation, because it was the right thing to encourage, and also because I was not, at that point, carrying any suspicion that required reservation. She'd lost weight gradually, become more energetic in a way I'd found attractive when I was home. She'd mentioned the gym owner once or twice, good businessman, ran a clean operation, occasionally organized group fitness events. Brandon. Mentioned with the specific casualness of someone who has practiced mentioning a name until the practice is invisible. I didn't catch it. I was away. That's not an excuse, it's a fact about distance and its specific vulnerabilities. When you're not physically present, you lose access to the nonverbal dimension of information. You can't see the micro-adjustment when a name comes up. You can't feel the temperature of a room change. You have only words, and words are the easiest thing to manage. I came back from the Flagstaff run on a Thursday evening, 41 hours earlier than planned. A mechanical issue with the return load had rerouted me, freed me up 2 days ahead of schedule, the kind of thing that happens often enough in long haul that it's not remarkable, except that this time I hadn't called ahead. Reception in the Painted Desert stretch was unreliable, and I'd figured the surprise would be welcome. Maya was at school. Dena's car was in the driveway. The unfamiliar truck was not, which told me nothing by itself. Dena answered the door in workout clothes, genuinely surprised to see me, and the surprise looked real, because it was real, I think. What came after the surprise was harder to read. A fraction of a second of something that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite alarm, something in between, a rapid internal calculation I witnessed without being able to name. Then she hugged me. This time she held on. I told myself the earlier hug, the clean release before the Flagstaff departure, had been exhaustion. I told myself the calculation I'd seen was just the adjustment of a woman shifting from solo mode back to shared space. I told myself a lot of things in the 40 minutes before Hank showed up at my door with his phone in his hand and a look on his face I'd never seen before. Hank had texted me when I was 2 hours out from Amarillo. "You back early?" When I confirmed, he'd said he was coming over. He'd arrived before I'd finished unpacking, which told me he'd been waiting. He sat at my kitchen table with a coffee he didn't drink and showed me what was on his phone. He'd gone back. After the July drive passed and the 6 weeks of sitting on it, he'd driven through my street twice more on subsequent trips and taken photos the second time, the unfamiliar truck in my driveway, time-stamped, on a Tuesday afternoon in September. He'd run the plate through a contact he had from his years around the transport industry. The truck was registered to a business, Iron Ridge Fitness, Amarillo. Brandon's gym. I looked at the photos for a long time. Then I looked at Hank. "How many times?" I said. "Twice that I saw," he said. "I don't know what I didn't see." We sat in my kitchen for a while after that. Dena was upstairs. I could hear her moving around. Maya would be home from school in 2 hours. "I need you to go," I said to Hank. "Not because of you. I just need to think." He nodded and left without another word, which is the specific value of a friend who understands when language is not the right tool. I did not confront Dena that afternoon. I thought about it. I sat in the backyard under the cottonwood tree that Maya had been trying to climb for 3 years, and I thought about walking inside and putting Hank's phone photos on the kitchen counter and watching what happened. The impulse was strong. The impulse was also, I recognized, not strategic, it was emotional, which meant it would produce an emotional outcome, denials, tears, explanations designed to manage my reaction rather than tell me the truth. I needed the truth. Not a managed version of it. So, I called Walt. Walt had been recommended by a dispatcher I'd known for years who'd used him during a custody dispute. He was 55, ex-insurance investigator, currently private, and he answered my call on the second ring at 4 in the afternoon as if he'd been waiting for it. I told him what I had. He told me what he needed. We agreed on terms. I went back inside and helped Maya with homework and ate dinner with my family and said nothing, and the discipline that cost me is not something I can adequately describe. The red herring arrived the following week and nearly derailed everything. Jess, Dena's neighbor and closest friend, who lived 3 houses down and whose presence in our social life I had always accepted without examination, called me on my cell. Not Dena's cell. Mine. She said she needed to talk to me about Dena, said there was something I should know, said she'd been worried for a while. We met for coffee at a place on Georgia Street, away from the neighborhood. What Jess told me was that Dena had been struggling emotionally, that she'd been lonely during the long routes, that she'd confided in Jess about feeling disconnected, about feeling like a single parent during the stretches when I was gone. That Brandon had been a friend initially, someone who'd listened, and that it had become something Jess didn't feel right about and had told Dena so. She framed it as concern. As loyalty to me alongside loyalty to Dena. I listened to all of it. I thanked her. I went back to my truck and sat for a long time processing what she told me and why she told me. Walt, when I reported the conversation, said something that recalibrated my read of Jess entirely: "She's managing your response. Not necessarily for bad reasons, maybe she genuinely cares about both of you. But she called you, not Dena, which means she's trying to control what you know and how you feel about it before you find out the rest yourself." I asked what he meant by the rest. He said to give him 4 more days. Walt's report arrived on a Friday morning via a secure file transfer he'd set up specifically for clients in sensitive situations. I opened it in my truck, parked at a fuel depot on the east side of Amarillo where no one I knew was likely to walk past. The documentation covered 14 months. Not weeks. Months. Brandon's truck had been at my house or Dena's car had been at Iron Ridge Fitness, after hours, when the gym was closed, on at least 32 occasions that Walt had been able to document through a combination of his own surveillance and traffic camera footage he'd obtained through a contact in the city. The pattern was consistent: Tuesdays and Thursdays when I was on a long run, occasionally a Saturday morning when Maya was at her grandmother's. The relationship had begun, by Walt's reconstruction, approximately 2 months after Dena first joined the gym. 14 months. Maya had told me about Brandon fixing the faucet 8 months ago. Which meant by the time my 9-year-old daughter was casually mentioning his name over a video call, this had been going on for 6 months already. I sat with the math for a long time. Then I thought about the faucet. About Dena telling me a neighbor had fixed it. Technically true, Brandon did live in the general area, and he had fixed it. The truth, deployed as camouflage. That is a specific skill, and it requires practice to develop. Which meant she'd been practicing. The financial dimension emerged on page 4 of Walt's report and introduced a complication I hadn't anticipated. Brandon's gym had been struggling financially for the previous 8 months. Walt had pulled the business registration and found 2 liens against the property. During that same period, our joint savings account had seen 6 withdrawals totaling just over $4,000, each one in the range of $500 to $800, each attributed in Dena's notation to household expenses, repairs, Maya's school supplies, medical. I went through our receipts. The repairs were real: the faucet, a new water heater, legitimate costs. But 2 of the withdrawals, totaling $1,400, had no corresponding receipt I could locate. I didn't jump to conclusions about where the money went. I noted the discrepancy. I gave the documentation to Sandra, who had been my attorney for estate matters and who I called that Friday afternoon. Sandra was 60, methodical, and entirely unshockable in the way that family law attorneys either are from the beginning or become within 5 years of practice. She listened to everything, reviewed the documents Walt had compiled, and said, "You've been thoughtful about this. That's going to matter." She outlined the path forward. I told her I needed 2 more weeks before anything was filed, because I needed to time it correctly. I had a run scheduled, a shorter one, for days to El Paso and back. I wanted to be home when things moved. Sandra agreed. She began preparing. The secondary twist came from an unexpected direction, as the most significant ones always do. Hank called me the Tuesday of that 2-week window. He'd run into Brandon at a fuel station on the west side of the city, not deliberately, just geography, and Brandon had recognized Hank's rig from the neighborhood and had come over to talk. Which was, in itself, a remarkable piece of confidence from a man who'd been parking his truck in my driveway. Brandon, according to Hank, had asked casually whether Cole was back from his latest run. Hank had said yes. Brandon had nodded and said, "Good. Things are complicated enough." Hank had no idea what to do with that, so he'd called me. I knew what to do with it. Brandon knew I was home. Which meant Dena had told him. Which meant the communication between them was current and active and not a thing of the past, not something that had wound down or concluded. It was ongoing as of that Tuesday, 3 weeks after I'd come home early from Flagstaff. The final piece I needed was the phone. I found it without searching for it, which carries its own irony given Nathan's story. That's the last one: different man, different life, same Sunday quality of accidental discovery. I was looking for Maya's library book, which had gone missing for 3 days and which we'd been fined for before. I checked the usual places: couch cushions, under Maya's bed, the kitchen counter, and then checked the small table by the front door where things accumulated. The library book was there, under a canvas bag. Dena's phone was also there. Face up. She was in the shower. I didn't unlock it. I didn't need to. The notification preview on the screen was visible without unlocking, a message from a contact named B, just the initial, like Diane in the last story, but this one I understood immediately. That read, "Miss you. When's he gone again?" Timestamped that morning. While I was in the backyard helping Maya attempt the cottonwood tree for what felt like the 100th time. I set the phone back exactly as I'd found it. Found the library book. Brought it to Maya. Went to my truck and called Sandra and told her we were ready. I chose a Saturday. Maya was at her grandmother's, Dena's mother, who lived 40 minutes outside Amarillo and who took Maya for occasional weekends as she had since Maya was small. The arrangement had been made by Dena herself, 2 weeks prior. I had not commented on the timing. I had noted it. The house was quiet when I came downstairs at 8 in the morning. Dena was at the kitchen table with coffee and her phone, the phone I had not touched and had not mentioned. She looked up when I came in, said good morning, went back to whatever she was reading. I put the folder on the table. She looked at it. Then at me. Then back at the folder. "What is this?" she said, though her voice had already answered the question. 14 months of documentation, I said. Walt's full report. Bank records. Sandra has copies of everything. I sat down across from her. I'm not here to fight. I'm here to tell you that I know, and that the process has already started, and to give you the chance to say whatever you want to say. She didn't open the folder. She looked at her coffee cup for a long time. How long have you known? She said finally. Since the Flagstaff run. Hank showed me photos. She nodded slowly. Something in her face was doing the same calculation I'd seen in the doorway when I came home early, but slower now, more visible, like a machine running at reduced speed. The money, she said. I need you to know that wasn't. Sandra knows about the money, I said. It's in the documentation. She stopped. Looked at me. You've been planning this. For 5 weeks, I said. Yes. The silence that followed was not dramatic. It was the silence of two people who have arrived at the end of something and are both aware that the ending is real and neither of them has a line written for this particular scene. 14 months, I said. Not as an accusation, I'd already processed the accusation. As a clarification. Maya's known his name for 8 months. That landed differently than anything else I'd said. Dena's eyes went wet, not performance, I could tell the difference, and she said, she doesn't know. She never knew anything. I know she didn't, I said. I've been careful about that. I'll keep being careful about that. I paused. She's the only thing I need us to agree on. Everything else, Sandra and whoever you retain can handle. Dena asked, quietly, whether there was any version of this where we tried to work through it. Whether I had considered that. I told her honestly that I had. That I'd spent 5 weeks with the information and considered it from every angle I could find. That 11 years mattered to me and that I was not someone who discarded things without full consideration. But I can't, I said. Not this. Not 14 months. Not Maya's name in the middle of it. She didn't argue. The absence of argument told me she'd already known what I would say, or had suspected it, and had asked anyway because she needed to have asked. I left her at the kitchen table and drove to my mother's house on the north side of the city and sat in her living room while she made coffee and didn't ask questions she already had answers to, because mothers of 40-year-old men generally understand when silence is the right offering. The divorce took 9 months. Sandra was precise and thorough, and the documentation Walt had compiled gave her a structural advantage that Dena's attorney, a man named Philip who was competent but working uphill, could not effectively counter. The settlement was fair by legal standards and honest by mine, the house sold, proceeds divided, primary custody of Maya structured around my route schedule in a way that Sandra had proposed and that both sides ultimately accepted because it was genuinely designed around Maya rather than around either of us. Dena moved to an apartment on the west side of Amarillo. I rented a smaller house, still on the east side, close enough to Maya's school that the logistics of shared custody didn't require military coordination. Brandon and Dena did not last. I know this not because I tracked it, I didn't, but because Jess, who had attempted a fence-sitting position throughout the proceedings and eventually landed on no one's side but her own, mentioned it to a mutual acquaintance who mentioned it to Hank who mentioned it to me in the way Hank mentioned things, briefly, once, without editorializing. The gym had closed. The financial situation had not improved. Whatever Brandon had represented to Dena during the 14 months had apparently not survived the loss of the circumstances that had enabled it. I registered that information and filed it. I did not feel the satisfaction that people sometimes expect you to feel about these outcomes. I felt, mostly, nothing, which I later understood was not absence of feeling but the specific neutrality of a man who had already moved past the point where that information could wound or gratify him. Autumn owns a diner called the Caprock, 12 miles east of Amarillo on the old Route 66 alignment, the kind of place that functions as a reliable fuel stop for long-haul drivers who know the secondary roads. I'd eaten there a dozen times over the years, good coffee, honest food, the specific comfort of a place that doesn't try to be more than it is. I stopped in on a Tuesday in May, 7 months after the Saturday confrontation, 4 months after the divorce was finalized. Autumn was behind the counter herself, she usually was, on weekdays, and we talked before in the brief, easy way of regular customers and small business owners who share a professional understanding of early mornings and long days. That Tuesday she asked how I was doing, and something in the way she asked it, direct, without the careful quality that people had been bringing to that question for months, made me answer honestly. Not fully. But honestly enough. We talked for 40 minutes. She refilled my coffee 3 times without my asking. When I stood to leave she said, "You come through here every 2-3 weeks, right?" "About that," I said. "Stop in," she said. "Not just for the coffee." I did. Regularly, then deliberately, then with the specific forward momentum that comes when something new begins to have its own weight and direction. Autumn is 37, widowed 4 years ago, runs the Caprock with the calm competence of someone who has rebuilt from a significant loss and carries the experience without making it the center of every conversation. She has a son, 12, who helps on weekends and who Maya, on the one occasion they've met, described as pretty okay, which is Maya's current highest grade of approval. We are not rushing anything. We are 2 people who understand the cost of rushing and the different cost of waiting too long, and we are navigating between those with appropriate care. That is enough. For now, that is more than enough. Maya climbed the cottonwood tree last September. Not the new house, I'd gone back to the old one, the one that was under contract by then, to collect the last few boxes, and Maya had come with me. She'd looked at the tree for a moment and then, with the focused determination I recognized as entirely her own, had gone up it. Not all the way, the upper branches were still beyond her reach, but far enough to sit in the first major fork and look out over the backyard with an expression of complete, uncomplicated satisfaction. "How's it look from up there?" I called. "Different," she said. "But good." I stood in the backyard of a house I was in the process of leaving and looked up at my daughter in the tree and thought that was probably the most accurate description of where I was too. Different. But good. The routes still take me away. Flagstaff, Albuquerque, El Paso, the long stretch across the painted desert where the light goes copper in October and makes everything look both closer and farther than it is. I still talk to Hank on the CB, still stop at the Caprock on the eastbound return, still call Maya every night I'm on the road. She answers on the first ring. Always. That's not a small thing. In the accounting of what matters, that might be everything. Cole's story lives in the specific geography of absence, not just physical distance, but the emotional distance that accumulates when a relationship is maintained primarily through phone calls and the goodwill of 2 people who have stopped examining what they're actually building. The long-haul life creates a structural vulnerability that Cole understood professionally and underestimated personally. When you're not present, you lose access to the nonverbal layer of information. You can't see the micro-adjustment when a name is mentioned. You can't feel the temperature change in a room. You have words, and words are the easiest thing to manage. The first red flag, Maya mentioning Brandon over a video call, casually, as someone who'd fixed the faucet and stayed for dinner, arrived with a child's perfect innocence and a child's perfect accuracy. Maya had no framework for what she was reporting. She was simply describing her day. And Cole, 3 states away and exhausted, filed the information under a category he kept too large and examined too rarely. The lesson here is not that Cole should have been more suspicious of a repairman. It's that the specific combination of a new name, a domestic task, and a shared meal is a cluster that deserves more than a mental filing and a return to the conversation at hand. One detail is ambient noise. 3 details in the same moment are a pattern. Jess's phone call is the story's most psychologically complex moment, and it rewards careful attention. She reached out to Cole, not Dena, before the investigation was complete, with a version of events designed to frame Dena's behavior as emotional rather than calculated: loneliness, disconnection, a friendship that got out of hand. Every element of what she said was plausible. Some of it was probably even true. But Walt's read was correct. She called Cole specifically, at that specific moment, to shape his emotional response before the fuller picture arrived. That is not the action of a neutral party. It is the action of someone managing a narrative, possibly out of genuine concern, possibly out of self-protection, probably both. The lesson is that the most effective misdirections are built on real information, arranged selectively. The turning point that changes everything is not the confrontation, it's the notification on Dena's phone. "Miss you. When's he gone again?" Cole had documentation, he had Walt's report, he had the financial discrepancy. But the notification, visible without unlocking, time-stamped that morning while he was in the backyard with Maya, collapsed the remaining distance between knowledge and certainty in a way that no investigator's report could quite replicate. It was immediate. It was present tense. It confirmed that this was not a concluded thing being uncovered but an ongoing thing still happening, in real time, in his own house, while his daughter tried to climb a tree in the yard. 2 lessons sit at the center of this story. The first is about the specific risk of a life structured around absence, not that long-haul work causes infidelity, but that sustained absence creates conditions that require more active maintenance than Cole gave them. The second lesson is harder and more universal, that trust, extended without periodic honest examination, eventually becomes a kind of willful blindness. Cole is not a fool. He saw the withdrawals. He heard Maya say Brandon's name. He felt the clean release of the goodbye hug before the Flagstaff run. He processed each signal individually, in isolation, and assigned it an innocent explanation. The failure was not in perception. It was in the decision, made quietly, repeatedly, without drama, not to connect the dots he was already holding. What this story ultimately reveals is how completely the architecture of a betrayal depends on the betrayed person's investment in not knowing. Cole was not passive or incurious, he was a man who had made, at some foundational level, a decision about who Dena was, and who then filtered everything he observed through that decision. The cash withdrawals registered and were filed. Maya's mention of Brandon registered and was filed. The goodbye hug registered and was filed. None of those signals were too subtle to notice, they were noticed. What failed was the willingness to let them mean what they meant. The karma dimension of this story, Brandon's gym closing, the relationship not surviving the changed circumstances, is not satisfying in the way revenge fantasies are satisfying. It's quieter than that. It simply demonstrates that a relationship built on the infrastructure of someone else's absence tends not to survive the removal of that infrastructure. What Dena and Brandon had was partially constructed from the specific conditions of Cole's long runs. When those conditions changed, what remained was less than either of them had apparently understood. Autumn is not a resolution to the story's central wound. She is evidence that Cole's capacity for genuine connection survived the damage, that the man who drove away from Amarillo on the Flagstaff run with a vague unease he couldn't name was still fundamentally intact on the other side of everything that followed. That continuity, quiet and undramatic, is the story's real ending. What stays with me about Cole's story is the cottonwood tree. 9 years of Maya trying to climb it, and she finally makes it the day they're leaving the house for good. Different. But good. There's something in that detail that feels more true than any of the legal or emotional resolution that precedes it. The things we build don't disappear when the circumstances change, they just looked different from the new vantage point. Cole lost a marriage and kept his daughter, kept Hank, kept his own integrity through 5 weeks of the hardest kind of silence. That's not nothing. In the full accounting of a life, that might be the most important column of all.